Thank you very much, Ron. It is a pleasure to be here. I hope that you would keep me on a short leash so that I also stay within 15 minutes. I work a lot with data, but as Rob mentioned, actually, in the very beginning, my book, published 5 years ago, the epigraph in that book was this sentence from David Runciman that I actually found, and I was never actually sure what he meant, but it appealed to me a lot. The sentence says, "This is the world in which everyone is sensitized to risk, but indifferent to fate." And I've tried this sentence on many of my friends, and they just don't get it. But recently, they have started getting it. And I think over the last 2 days, we have heard an enormous amount of discussion of risk. I don't know if risk has been mentioned more than probably 10,000 times in 2 days, but I will not speak of risk. Actually, I would speak of global income distribution, and as I will argue, the global, and actually show with data, the global income distribution is basically a result of two factors, and both are fate, which means they are not determined by your effort. And these factors are your citizenship and the parents' family, income level of the family where you were born. So this is a discussion of fate. Before I go on that, I have actually to go through my staple graph, which basically shows 3 ways that we can look at international or global inequality. Now, the top one shows you 3 individuals. They each come with an average income of their country, which is reflected in the height of these 3 individuals. So imagine basically running an inequality statistics over 180 countries, unweighted by their population. So it's like a General Assembly of the United Nations. Each country counts the same. Each country comes with a representative income, which is basically GDP per capita. Now, concept number 2, which is underneath, shows you the same height of individuals, so individuals still enter with their average incomes, but it's population weighted. So obviously China now would much more matter in this concept 2, global or actually international inequality, than a small country like Chad or Luxembourg and so on. But notice that the height of individuals is still representative income. Again, we will do the work with GDP per capita because that's the most accessible source. And basically, you need only 2 data points for each country here. You need mean income of that country, and you need population. Okay, what is the third one, which actually is the most interesting and the most difficult one? It is global inequality, which means that you take the entire world and you treat the entire world as if it were one country, and you do actually find, theoretically, using household surveys, you find income of every individual. You convert these incomes using purchasing power parity. I will not speak much about that. It's a huge topic on its own right. But then you basically convert them to express the welfare of each individual in the world. Now, one big thing there, of course, as you can see, now individuals come with their actual incomes. So the country which is in the middle might have an individual which is actually quite rich and quite poor. The big difference between concepts 1 and 2 and concept 3, on the other hand, is that concept 3 requires household survey data. So that was the reason why concept 3 has not been calculated until recently, because there were no data for important chunks of the world, like most of Africa, like China until 1982, and like the former Soviet Union until the late 80s. So what do we find then if we do concept 1, concept 2, and concept 3 calculation for the world between 1950 and 2007? This is called the mother of all inequality disputes, in reference to a world leader who liked to use this particular comparison, mother of all something. So in this case, it's mother of all inequality disputes. And why? You will see it in a second. Because this is the results that we get for concept 1 inequality. Remember, these are unweighted GDPs. Now, you will notice that with 1980s, and that was actually Jamie referred to that as well, we really have a beginning of big divergence of incomes. And that, of course, flies in face of everything that we have studied in neoclassical growth economics, where actually during globalization we were expecting, and actually much greater similarity of economic policies, we would expect great convergence to happen. Well, it did not happen. The convergence happened within the EU and within the rich world, but globally we have had divergence. Now, it's true, actually, in the last 6 years before the crisis, as you can see from the graph, actually I forgot to mention, the vertical axis is the Gini coefficient. So when that graph goes up, that means that there is greater inequality between mean incomes of the countries, which means that there is a divergence. When the graph goes down, then of course there is some convergence. So this is obviously by many people who are critical of globalization, they say, rightly so, incomes between countries have diverged. It is, as I said before, this is not something that we were expecting during the era of globalization, where exactly the opposite should have happened. However, with concept 2, something very different happened, because now we are weighting all these GDPs per capita. And here, basically, with mid-80s and early 90s, China obviously moves in a big way and starts driving this concept 2 inequality down. More recently, and I don't show it here, but elsewhere, I show it, India actually becomes the second engine of convergence according to concept 2 inequality. How about concept 3 inequality? As I said before, we cannot go backwards because there are no data, and because for each of these data points, which are now sort of jumping on these slides, you actually have to have in the background 120 approximately household surveys with thousands of individuals that I actually then divide into percentile groups and then calculate overall Gini. Now, as you can see, for global inequality, you don't see much of a trend. What you do see is that global inequality has a Gini coefficient which is today 70 Gini points. So I want you to remember that number. It's an important number. It has never been recorded in history that there was a country with a Gini of 70 points. It doesn't exist. Countries like South Africa and Brazil are countries of about 55 to 60 Gini points, not 70 Gini points. So the world is obviously a much more unequal place. If I were to use the same calculation, but not use PPPs, simply use actual dollars, that Gini would be 80. This is something absolutely unheard of. Just to give you another sort of idea what is a Gini of 70, US Gini, which of course is very high, is in the 40s range, 42, 43, 45. By the way, just a simple note for some of you from the European Union, currently the European Union, 27 members, if you take their actual incomes, and you can do that with Eurostat nowadays, actually European Union has the same Gini as the United States. But of course the origin of that high inequality in the EU is different because it includes poor and rich countries. So, but just sort of to bring to the attention the fact that the European Union is a pretty unequal place today. So this is the Gini coefficient for the world, and this is my concept 3 inequality. Now, the difficulty of figuring out intuitively what drives global inequality stems from the fact that it's driven by 3 forces of unequal magnitude, but 2 of them go or went in one direction, which was increasing inequality, and 1 of them went into a direction of reducing inequality. Now, the 2 that actually drove inequality up, as you can see here, are the first. Generally speaking, within national inequalities have gone up. And remember, these within national inequalities explain that the difference between concept 2 and concept 3, because what does concept 3 include? It includes the additional inequality, which is due to the fact that not all Chinese have the mean income of China, and not all Americans have the mean income of the United States. The second factor is the divergence of incomes, which I already mentioned, so that divergence obviously adds to global inequality as well. But the big equalizing factor is obviously China and India. Now, much of what will happen in the future will obviously depend on what happens to China and India and their growth rates with respect to the rich world. I'm going to go over that in a second, because this simply shows you the population coverage of this concept 3 data. Actually, it is the weakest, unfortunately, in Africa, so the measures of inequality basically underestimate true inequality, because quite a few, countries like Sudan, Zaire, Somalia are not included in the surveys. So this is simply giving you the same numbers that I've already explained. You will see here on the bottom this tremendous Gini of 80 Gini points if you do not adjust for PPPs, and this is when you adjust for PPPs. The most recent data, as you can see, have slightly lower Gini than the previous 5-year period, but obviously we are not talking about statistical significance of that. Now, what does actually Gini of 70 also mean? Well, there are many numbers here. Focus just on one number. 10% of the people in the world have 55% of global income. So it is not a 50-50 world. It's more than 50-50 world. 10% have 55 and 90% have 45. I gave here for comparison, for instance, just to see how it looks in a single country like Germany, where the top 10% have 25% of German income. I will skip that because I want to focus on some incendiary statistics, very easily understood, I think, in this audience, which is the income of the richest expressed in the income of the millions of the poorest. Now, I start with myself and say, what is the annual operating budget of the IMF and the World Bank? And I get that it's equal to the income of 70 million people, poorest people in the world, so 70 million. Then I say, okay, let's take Goldman Sachs bonus in 2009. Well, that's equal to 224 million poorest people, annual income of $250 million poorest people in the world. Then I take IRS report for 400 richest Americans in 2006. Well, they have income which is equal to 640 million poorest people in the world, which is approximately the population of Africa. So you have these 400 guys, and then you have 640 million people. That's a big difference. Then I take 1% of the richest Americans in 2005, and they have an income which is equal to income of 1.6 billion people, and of course 1% of the richest people in the world with income which is equal to 4.3 billion people. You might like or dislike numbers. The numbers per se don't have a sort of a message there, moral or otherwise, but they are useful to know. How was it in the long run? Is it something really special now that we see? Well, in the long run, this is the picture of concepts 1 and 2 based on medicine's data. Basically, the Industrial Revolution was this big bang which, of course, created rich countries and also countries that really remained at their old income level. And then gradually there was this increase throughout the 19th century of concept 1 and concept 2 inequality. And now we are kind of plateauing in these two concepts. However, there was one big difference that I really would like. These are not important things. These are actually technical things which explain the changes. But a big difference between then and now is this one. Is that if you take inequality in 1850, most of inequality, and this, when you decompose it, most of inequality was due to the fact that there are unequal people within countries. So they were rich people in England and rich people in France and rich people in the United States and rich people in maybe India and elsewhere. Most of inequality was due to what you can call class, which means your position within your own national income distribution. Nowadays, and that's why I speak of fate, nowadays the situation is exactly the opposite. If you decompose global inequality, most of it, actually 80% or more, is due to your location, which means your citizenship basically in a world with not much mobility of labor and citizens. So now you really have what I call the non-Marxian situation, because in 1870 you could argue that the conditions of workers and peasants in many countries were similar. Consequently, there could have been some commonality of interest between them. In 2000 or 2010, you cannot argue that, because the prevalent share of global inequality is due to the place of citizenship. And I will then have to go fast with the other slides, but I just wanted to mention an important, this is going to go away. This is for the Anglophones audiences. They love this, but it has to go away. You want Jane Austen? Okay, so let's go very briefly, 1 minute, Jane Austen. Within national income distributions have shrunk. So here I have Mr. Darcy, I have Elizabeth's family's per capita income, and I have Elizabeth alone, and many of you have read the book, so I will not explain necessarily. It's actually, she could happen to actually have that median income in the case that the property is not entailed, it's under the entail, and if she doesn't marry Mr. Darcy, she would end up with that amount of money. Now, we have social tables for UK, for England actually, more exactly, 1801, 1803. So we can locate these individuals, Mr. Darcy and the Bennets, in the income distribution of the time. And then you actually can compute that the advantage of marriage for Elizabeth is about 100 to 1, rather than remaining alone. It's a huge advantage, and of course marriage really seems a very, very exciting proposition under such conditions. It is less exciting, I mean, it is still exciting today because we also take the income distribution today, locate these people from various income distributions, and find their place. And then the ratio here is 20 to 1. So that was my illustration for the changes in within component. So remember, there are two things here. The between component, which means between countries, has really become much more important. And the within component in the long term, despite the recent increases in inequality in the US and China and UK, has become, over the long term, less important. And this is what you can see also in this particular slide, where you actually see the position of each percentile of German income distribution, which is on the horizontal axis, and you see their position in the global income distribution. So now you see the poorest Germans actually are at the 70th percentile of the world income distribution, the poorest 1 percentile of Germans. If you take India, or I could take many other countries, you actually end up with the richest 1 percentile, only at something like 80th percentile of the world income distribution. In other words, these distributions do not overlap. And this is, we'll just sort of skip to a few others. This is the reason, this is a very interesting one, this is Brazil. Because Brazil's distribution goes from the bottom, actually the poorest Brazilians are as poor as anybody else in the world, to the 100th percentile, because the richest Brazilians belong to the top percentile. And the result of these unequal distributions, and that I will finish there, is unequal incomes between the countries, is that, as I started with fate, is that 60% of variability in personal incomes can be explained by single variable, which is the mean income of your country, the country where you're born. If by some sort of tricks, I also introduce there, depending on the coefficients of mobility of income within your country, introduce their adjustment for the probabilistic adjustment for what was the income class of your family, I'm able to explain about 80% of global variability in personal incomes. I would submit, that's the last statement, I would submit it's a big thing, actually, if you tell me that at this very moment, there are, let's suppose, thousands of kids who are being born. And then at this very moment, we can say, with these two variables which we know at this very instant, where are they born and who are the parents, that we can say, we can get an R-square of 0.8 about their future incomes. I think it's something, it's that effect, you can think, like it, not like it, but I think, as I think Lenin sort of said, the facts are stubborn, and unless things change, that fact is not going to go away. Thank you very much.